Hello, the EU has imposed major tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in a bid to protect European car manufacturers. Istanbul Airport has welcomed over 300 million passengers in the 6 years it's been open, placing it among the world's top 10 busiest airports. And we'll look at the impact of US sanctions on the global economy. Hello there, I'm Charlotte Brewer-Edney with the latest business and finance news right here on TRT World. The European Union's new tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles signal a sharp escalation in trade tensions aimed at protecting EU automakers from what they perceive as unfair competition. The levies not only challenge Chinese manufacturers, but also risk sparking retaliatory measures that could impact a range of EU industries. As trade negotiations continue, both sides face economic and strategic challenges that could reshape their global market positions. Let's take a closer look. In 2023, EU-China trade in goods reached $799 billion, underscoring the high stakes of these new tariffs. Chinese EV exports to Europe surged by 70% last year, a rate the new levies seek to decelerate. Well, the tariffs range from 8% to over 35%. And they could significantly hinder Chinese automakers, many of whom are already restricted from entering the US market. BYD, one of the top Chinese EV manufacturers, has rapidly ascended into the global top 10. The EU tariffs now pose a potential slowdown. The stakes are particularly high for companies facing double-digit tariffs, which may deter further expansion in Europe. Meanwhile, European car makers such as BMW and Mercedes-Benz fear a loss of market share in China, affecting sales as they navigate this complex trade dispute. Volkswagen has already announced factory closures, highlighting the impact of these trade tensions on EU-based manufacturers. This conflict may weaken EU automakers' global competitiveness if Chinese retaliation impacts European exports to China. Well, despite the new tariffs, EU and Chinese officials are in talks to explore alternative pricing agreements, but progress remains limited. Potential tariff reductions for specific manufacturers relocating production to the EU could provide a temporary reprieve. Retaliatory tariffs from China are anticipated, potentially targeting a $3 billion worth of EU exports, from cars all the way to agricultural goods. Well, the United States, meanwhile, imposes more sanctions than any other country, impacting more than a third of the world's nations. Positions between diplomacy and warfare, these economic tools have become a central pillar of US foreign policy. Tala Duman explains.
Sanctions may disrupt the balance of political power in unstable regimes and destroy personal fortunes and national industries by cutting their targets off from the Western financial system, all without putting a single American soldier in danger. U.S. sanctions have a long history. In Cuba, sanctions imposed over 60 years ago failed to overthrow the regime but limited access to crucial medical supplies. Since the 1970s, sanctions on Iran haven't been able to change its government, but have pushed the country into alliances with Russia and China, reshaping the nation's geopolitical stance. In Syria, Bashar al-Assad remains in power despite 20 years of U.S. sanctions. The country is struggling to rebuild from civil war, and more Syrians than ever are expected to need critical humanitarian assistance this year. U.S. sanctions now reach countries including Afghanistan, Russia, and North Korea, often with severe economic and social impacts on their populations. Sanctions have contributed to major outcomes like ending apartheid in South Africa and prompting Iran's nuclear negotiations, but they've also failed to deter North Korea's nuclear pursuits and Russia's aggression in Ukraine, in some cases with unintended consequences like Moscow's so-called shadow fleet of oil tankers. Sanctions are costly, creating a multi-billion-dollar industry in Washington. They drive autocratic regimes toward black market trade, strengthening criminal networks and encouraging adversarial cooperation to bypass penalties.
Well, Ross Feingold is head of research at Cirrus Consulting, and he joins us now from Taipei in Taiwan. We've heard a little bit there about some of the mixed outcomes of these sanctions. So how effective do you think the US sanctions are as a tool for achieving long-term political change in targeted nations?
It's certainly fair to say that the result of sanctions over the past many decades it's certainly a mixed result. It doesn't really or all the time bring about a broad political change, but we should also keep in mind that when individuals or companies or industries are sanctioned, it is very painful for the other side. So I'd be very hesitant to say that that sanctions, whether they're against companies, individuals, entire industries, countries, are completely without merit or completely without any effect. It is very, very painful for the people who are on the other side of those sanctions in numerous ways. And that includes not just directly, but also because of secondary sanctions as well. And financial institutions are unwilling to do business with people or companies who are sanctioned. Again, that could be very, very painful.
Well, one thing that sanctions don't seem to be able to affect is regime change. And indeed, as we were hearing, many of the regimes the US considers less than desirable are still in power decades on after sanctions. Does that mean then that there can be sanctions fatigue, if you like? And does that risk undermining US influence and decision making?
Yeah, that's also a very fair question to ask, but I don't think we've seen sanctions fatigue, because we see that Western countries specifically, not just the United States acting alone, but its close partners from Western Europe or Canada, Australia, Japan, they're still willing to use sanctions as a tool to try to punish what they perceive to be bad behavior. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a good example of that, where a lot of Western countries joined in the United States in putting sanctions on Russian industries or Russian individuals who are very close to President Putin's government. So I don't think there's fatigue, even though, yes, you're correct. There's certainly examples, and Cuba and Iran are very good examples, where sanctions, and they're very broad sanctions, did not bring about an equally broad political change. And in fact, those governments are still in power after many, many decades. But again, it's not without an enormous amount of pain and trying to make do with a situation that's very bad for them.
And how would you say that US sanctions have influenced global trade alliances? For example, countries like Iran shifting towards deeper ties with Russia and China. We've just had that BRICS summit, which of course was talking about alternative payments, alternatives to the dollar. How do you think these sanctions change all of that, change those dynamics?
Well, certainly countries that are the subject of sanctions, or individuals and specific companies, they're going to look for trading partners who are not participating in the sanctions. So we see a lot of Russia, in some cases China, activity in places around the world where governments are not going to participate in US sanctions. And Africa would be a very good example of that. And we see how active, certainly before the Ukraine war, for example, how active the Wagner Group was in Africa. Again, it's still going to be a tool that's going to be continued to be employed by the Western countries led by the United States. And then the countries that are targets, they're going to try and come up with ways to get around the sanctions, whether that's new partners or de-dollarization, where there's been a lot of talk about central bank digital currencies. But the results so far, frankly, are very limited, because it's extraordinarily difficult to replace the role of the US dollar as the global settlement currency for trade. I mean, there will be some replacement for sure of the US dollar, but it's going to be so small compared to the overall amount of global trade.
All right, understood. Ross Feingold from Taipei in Taiwan, thank you so much for joining us on TRT World's Business Show.
Thank you.
The new UK government is set to unveil its spending plans in a highly anticipated budget. It faces the challenge of balancing two key promises: avoiding tax hikes for working people while also increasing public investment. Tulay Kalyon Hazne Darolu explains.
For the governments worldwide, budgets are crucial, but some stand out, like the UK's 2024 autumn budget. Chancellor Rachel Reeves will present Labour's first budget in 14 years, one of the most anticipated fiscal events in decades. And the Labour Party has repeatedly said that it needs to make difficult financial decisions ahead of it.
I fundamentally believe that we need to run towards the tough decisions. I fundamentally believe we have to fix the foundations so that we can build a better future. And that's tough. That's difficult. But that's why we're taking the decision on Wednesday to do it, because it's the right thing to do, and it's the right thing for our country.
The budget will set out government's plans for the economy, including changes to taxation and spending. Chancellor Reeves is now looking to make tax increases and spending cuts worth £40 billion, according to government sources. Reports also suggest that the government will announce a bigger-than-expected increase in the national minimum wage. An expected £10 billion will be allocated to NHS to address waiting lists, equipment and staffing needs. Additional support for housing and education is also expected in the budget. Conservatives have criticised Labour's fiscal outlook, claiming it's a pretext for planned tax hikes. But Reeves says, regarding the government's finances, Labour inherited the worst set of circumstances since the Second World War. Tülay Kalyon Haznedaroğlu, TRT World, London.
Okay, let's take a quick look at some of the other stories at the top of the business agenda. Google parent company Alphabet saw its stock rise 6% in after-hours trading following the release of strong fiscal third-quarter earnings that exceeded analysts' expectations. The company posted earnings per share of $2.12 on revenue of $88.27 billion, driven by significant growth in its cloud business. This marks a 37% profit increase and a 15% rise in sales compared to the previous year. President Joe Biden has announced a $3 billion investment in port infrastructure during his visit to the Port of Baltimore. His trip came 7 months after the collapse of the harbour, which resulted in the deaths of 6 construction workers and disrupted shipping routes. The investment aims to modernise US ports and improve air quality by eliminating over 3 million metric tonnes of carbon pollution over the next decade. Australia's inflation slowed to a 3.5-year low in the third quarter, helped by government rebates on electricity and falling petrol prices. Annual inflation dropped to 2.8%. That's back within the central bank's target range for the first time since 2021. However, prices for services remain high, keeping core inflation at 3.5%. It means the Reserve Bank of Australia is likely to delay rate cuts until next year, with 2025 now seen as the key target for normalising rates. And in just 6 years, Istanbul Airport has transformed Turkish aviation, hosting more than 370 million passengers and securing its place as a global hub. Known for its impressive terminals, independent runways and top-notch amenities, Istanbul Airport connects travellers to over 120 countries and over 320 destinations. Not only Europe's busiest airport, it has won global acclaim as the best airport in the world and in Europe for serving over 40 million passengers. With 2.14 million flights and 1.4 million tonnes of cargo under its wing, Istanbul Airport is setting the gold standard in world travel. Welcome back. Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba's Liberal Democratic Party has suffered a major setback at the weekend, losing its parliamentary majority in an historic election blow. While economic challenges and rising living costs swayed voters, Ishiba admitted that the recent corruption scandal within his party was the main reason for their defeat. Well, the scandal involves political funds raised from party event ticket sales, with individuals, companies and organisations buying tickets. It's claimed that dozens of lawmakers within the LDP siphoned off profits from these sales as kickbacks, reportedly falsifying accounting records to cover their tracks. Well, the fallout has deeply eroded public trust and fueled discontent among voters, unsurprisingly. This election defeat then is raising questions about the future of the 67-year-old Premier's leadership. The political uncertainty has intensified selling pressures on the yen, pushing the currency to its lowest level in 3 months as investors brace for further instability. Well, on Tuesday, the head of a prominent opposition party urged the Bank of Japan to avoid any drastic changes to its already ultra-loose monetary policy, suggesting that the ruling coalition's loss is already complicating its approach to rate hikes. The Bank of Japan, then, is widely expected to keep short-term rates steady at just 0.25% during Thursday's policy meeting. All right, for more on this, we're joined by Shigeru Takeshita. He's a professor at the School of Management and Informatics at the Graduate School at the University of Shizuoka. So, the yen has weakened as investors react to the LDP's defeat. How does this add to challenges around inflation and stabilizing the Japanese economy?
Well, considering the fact that we basically import virtually all our oil, and the fact that we're very vulnerable to these price hikes, certainly weakening the yen would exacerbate the worries over inflation. Of course, Japanese inflation right now that we're seeing is cost-push inflation, which is induced by external factors and not deep-rooted like that of the United States or United Kingdom, which is demand-pull inflation. But that said, of course, people are feeling the pain. If you look at the diffusion index by Bank of Japan, which focuses on people's living standards and how they feel, it's minus 54, which is the lowest level since the Lehman crisis. So you can tell that people are starting definitely to feel the pain on this situation.
Now, the opposition party has urged the central bank to avoid any knee-jerk reactions and overhauling monetary policy. But do you think the Bank of Japan can really afford to delay its rate hikes without risking further instability?
Those are the questions that should have been asked during the election or before. But surprisingly, no one really touched it. And as you connotate, government should not intervene with the decision-making of central banks, but in Japan, as you strongly connotate, they do. And unfortunately, I think, yes, they will be swayed very much by the swing factors of the political side in Japan. But the fact of the matter is, the Bank of Japan really do not have the deep pocket that many people think. Of course, we have to put discipline into our financial system, considering that we have such high debt to GDP, lowest birth rate only next to Korea in this region, and fastest growing senior citizens. So obviously we have to consider these things, but this is one subject that people are almost avoiding, and certainly I think Bank of Japan should normalize their rates. But at this moment, considering the position of Bank of Japan and the economy at its state, it would be pretty difficult to start normalizing rates at this moment, I think.
Okay. And what about policy? Do you think we could see new government measures focus specifically on tackling inflation? And if so, how effective might they be?
Well, the fact of the matter, again, is that, we import virtually all our basic commodities, and weakening the yen induces further, exacerbates the situation. So when we see, this cost-push inflation hitting us, one of the methodology that the government probably will try to induce is a lot of verbal intervention, because in my opinion, as I said, Bank of Japan really do not have the deep pocket that many people think. So they would try to basically introduce verbal, intervention. But what they have to do is get a coalition from the United States and Europe as well, because we all know that the singular intervention by the central government, central bank, isn't going to work anymore because market powers are much, much stronger.
Okay, Shigeru Takeshita, thank you so much for joining us here on TRT World.
Thank you.
Now, the escalation of hostilities in Lebanon follows a year in which Israel and Hezbollah have exchanged regular exchanges of fire in the border region. The violence has prompted hundreds of thousands to flee their homes in both countries and had a significant impact on parts of the Israeli economy. Shadia Edwards-Dashti reports from the Israeli city of Akka, which has now become practically a ghost town.
The war on the border rages on. Rocket after rocket launched into Israel, with much of the north on high alert. Akka, an Arab-Israeli city on the Mediterranean coast, is in the firing line. Once a tourist hotspot renowned for its world-famous fish and iconic sunsets, it's now a shadow of what it once was. With mass evacuations and remaining residents living in fear of strikes, it's no place for visitors. Businesses are close to going bust.
تأثير كبير We lost more than 90% of work. The restaurant is empty. There is no one in it. We get maybe 2 tables during 12 hours of work. It's getting worse. We are so stressed about money. Plus, we go to work with fear, as there is always sirens. We don't feel safe.
With no need for the catch of the day, empty nets lie in the harbour.
There is no business anymore in Akka, I told you, because the wall. Have you seen the fishermen people? Most, it's closed. Nobody fishing now, it's afraid, the people, they're afraid.
The city of Akka would normally be full of people, but this is not a normal circumstance. While it may appear calm, things can change amid war at any moment. The sound of silence replaced by sirens multiple times a day, the noise warning of an imminent potential attack. Walking around the old town with barely a soul in sight, a lost visitor mourned the city's losses.
When I came here, I was shocked. I didn't expect it to be empty like this. Honestly, as soon as I came and saw the situation, I started crying. Accra has never been like this. It's awful.
According to economic experts, Israel's ongoing conflict on all fronts will have lasting financial consequences.
The direct cost of this war is rising, and it's affecting all aspects of life in Israel. The deficit is rising. It's exceeding any number that the Israelis were thinking of.
In comparison to the human cost of Israel's military onslaught, the economic impact may be just a drop in the ocean. But in the north of the country, the ripple effects of war and bombardment have an effect on every aspect of life. Shadia Edwards-Dashti, TRT World, Accra.